talk about the hydrologic cycle and habitats, and the habitats are related to what the organisms experience in the hydrologic cycle, and then how water moves. So, if you remember, we had a graph where we were talking about water flow versus the range of spatial and temporal scales. But we can also think about the way the environment is structured on physically in different scales. And so we can think of what we might call microhabitat. And I'm not talking about microhabitat from the point of view of the way fish people talk about it, because microhabitat to fish people is like a log or a rock. And that's like decimeter scale habitat, not micrometer scale habitat. So my terminology is a little bit different from that. Mine's right, theirs wrong, it's wrong. If you follow SI units, that is. Just to be clear what we're talking about. So basically microhabitat, say, can alter and it changes, a second to a year, maybe a micron to a millimeter. Fine particles of sand and clay, surfaces of organisms, bacteria are about that size, maybe zooplankton. Macrohabitat is changing on days to years, maybe up to 1,000 meters. So we might talk about riffles and pools of streams, ponds, small wetlands. Local habitat, we can think of a larger lake, maybe could take 100 years to turn over, could be 100 kilometers long, a series of riffles and streams. And then watersheds is the next hydrologic unit up, where you have an area feeding a small stream into the basins of large rivers. So where all the water runs into, and all the weathering and geomorphology and all that stuff is related to that type of scale. A landscape would be a mosaic of these habitats or watersheds. And then finally we have the continents that are the composite of very large drainage basins and aquifers. And the continents are on the orders of 10,000 kilometers, and they are evolving on the scale of times of, say, tens of thousands of years, glacial cycles, say, to continental drift, which is getting closer and closer to the age of the Earth. And again, it's a similar range, the full range of scales that organisms are evolved with and interact with. Okay, so we talked about the hydrologic cycle. And it's very straightforward for the most part, and you've had this since you were, first grade, right? The water comes up from the ocean, it evaporates, and then it comes down in precipitation. And if it is taken up by plants, it can be transpired back to the atmosphere. And it can also evaporate right off the surface of the Earth without going through plants. So those two together are called evapotranspiration. Essentially, you should know every single one of these terms on here. And if you don't know them yet, you should have them memorized. If it gets down into the very top of the soil, it is infiltrating the soil. If it moves down into the groundwater, it is percolating down. It is infiltrating and percolating. So you can infiltrate and then evapotranspirate if the roots get it before it goes up. But if it gets past the root zone, then it percolates down into the soil. And then we have water that's flowing either subsurface or surface, and much of it eventually will make it to the ocean and start the cycle again. So very straightforward. Again, you've seen a lot of these terms again. Maybe these evapotranspiration, infiltration, and percolation are new terms for you that you need to pay attention to. And now we're getting into perhaps some terminology that you don't have in your head so much, because it's terminology that's specifically related to groundwaters. And we have this soil on the surface and this beautiful tree that looks like a mushroom that I drew, but it's really a tree. It could be a mushroom, I suppose. But you get past this rich area of soil into the vadose or the unsaturated zone. And sometimes the water table, the part where all the particles all the space between the particles are filled with water, is right up at the surface. And what is that called if it's right up at the surface? What is it called when the water table's at the surface of the planet? spring if it's coming up, yeah, or a lake, or a wetland, or if it's in a valley, it's a river. So any place where, those are all places where the water table intersects the surface of the land. But out here, most of the places, we have this sort of dryish zone, and then a drought with quite a bit of dryish zone, and eventually we get down to an aquifer. And at the top of the aquifer, there's this little area where the surface tension of the water causes the water to be drawn up by capillary action, and it's called the capillary fringe. This can be important because it is a hot spot for biogeochemical activity, and it's also a place where there's this strong interaction between pollutants that come down into the groundwater and the water itself. If you have an area where you kind of have a basin underground that water can't flow through, you can actually end up with a perched water table higher. So not all of the water table is at the same level. And this is a perfect example of this in this part of the area where you have these limestone shale areas, where you kind of have these areas that there's water, and then you go down to the next layer and there's not much, and you go down, there's more water. So some of these are perched, and then if there's a hole punch, the gravity will take it down to the next level. An aquifer can be unconsolidated, that is just a bunch of, say, sand or small rocks or something, and homogeneous, all the same. Or it can be heterogeneous. So you can have big chunks of rocks, and then you can imagine if there's water flow, the flow paths become very complex when you have a heterogeneous aquifer, as opposed to a homogeneous aquifer where things can just move through in an even flow. And then you can have impermeable layers where nothing can get through of rock. And some of the aquifers that we have an impermeable layer on the top and the bottom, and those would be considered confined aquifers. So you get in a place where you've got what an artesian well or a spring where you drill down and the force of the water is forcing water to come out. You basically have to have an impermeable layer, two impermeable layers where that is, that you're punching into, and then higher water somewhere else above that impermeable layer. A bunch of terminology that you need to memorize, and you do so pretty quickly, because as we go through the ecology of groundwaters, wetlands, all these things, and we talk about things like bioremediation, pollutants entering groundwater, we need to know these terms. This is an image that was drawn by Sarah Blair. She's John Blair's spouse. Had John Blair for fundamental ecology. Now she's a realtor, but for a while she was an artist. And this shows the idea of different groundwater habitats. So in the very top left-hand corner, we have a karstic region where the limestone can dissolve, and we get these caves and channels through it, right? So that would be, if there's water table above that, then that would make for a heterogeneous aquifer, correct? These are basically characterized by a very rapid throughput of water. Rain can be transmitted through them for the most part. And then these might come out, and the surface of the water table hits the surface, and it makes a lake. Okay, so in this case, we have an impermeable layer and another impermeable layer, and there's this pressure head, and the water then is slowly flowing through this permeable area in this confined aquifer out to a lake or the ocean. In this particular case, the ocean. So somebody took a well and drilled it into this layer, right? And the surface of that well was lower than this lake that's feeding that impermeable layer, so that creates an artesian well. Or if there's a natural channel in there, it would be an artesian spring that's shooting up from the bottom. In this case, if you drill a well, the water table level is about equal to where that lake was. If we pull a well in to these areas and we pump very heavily out of them, what we'll do is we'll deplete the groundwater level around there. So you get this zone of depletion where the water table is deeper than it would be if you hadn't put the well in and pumped out of it. So this zone of depletion, if the flow of water into the area is not very fast and you're pumping very quickly, it can be quite deep. In areas that are close to salt waters, this can be very important, particularly in coastal areas where you have this zone of depletion and the water that's moving in to replace it is salt water. Then it can contaminate your well, make the water undrinkable. Bronson? Any question?
Can it be recovered? Like if it's really depleted, can it ever be recovered?
It depends on the rate of rain, of infiltration, of percolation, and how quickly you withdraw it. So the Ogallala aquifer is an example right now of one that we're using it much faster. Yes, it could be replenished, but it could take thousands of years at the rate we're using it. So in our lifetimes, no. Does anybody know in Kansas where there's a case of, pretty bad case of saltwater intrusion related to harvesting fresh water from groundwater? Anybody familiar with that? Has anybody heard of the Equus beds? Okay, so Wichita, it takes part of its water from groundwater, and it sits next to an aquifer that's pretty salty. And if you know what do they get out of Hutchinson? What's their mines in Hutchinson? Salt, right? So what you have is actually you have these ancient evaporated sea bottoms that are down there. Part of them are impinging on aquifers, so those waters have a lot of brine in them. And further to the south, when they take the fresh water out for Wichita, this zone of depletion is causing the water to move in from the salty groundwater. It's contaminating their drinking water. So there's a big issue as far as the amount of salt contamination, and they've had to make up for that by building a reservoir, which has nutrient pollution problems and toxic algae, and they've built themselves another problem coming the other direction. So there's some good examples of how humans interact with the aquatic environment here, and some of the things that we have to keep in mind and understand about our aquatic resources. Okay, so I'm throwing a lot of terminology at you. I would really suggest studying this as you go, not waiting till the day before the test to learn all this. And it's going to be, this is the case with any biology class, right? You have to memorize a lot of terms. Some of them you know, some of them you don't, but it's important. So in karstic regions, you get this dissolving of limestone and caves and underground streams. And one of the things that happens with these karstic regions is that occasionally one of those caves, big caves, will collapse. Yes. K-A-R-S-T-I-C. Karst. Got it, everyone? K-A-R-S-T-I-C, karstic. And the area is called a karst topography. And so if you look at these topographies, they tend to be pretty rugged. They tend to have, the extreme ones tend to have a lot of holes and pits in them. If any of you have been to the Yucatan, how many of you have been to the Yucatan? You've been there and seen the cenotes or seen the Chichen Itza, seen where they throw all the sacrifices and stuff in there. That's just a big limestone conduit that they had down there. There's some paintings of Chinese area that have these improbably convoluted and steep sort of hills coming up out of the ocean. That's actually an area where the karstic area where the oceans got into. So it leads to some very interesting topographies. In this case, this unfortunate person built their house on top of what was a cave that then collapsed, and the whole thing formed a sinkhole. And this will actually be one of the ways that lakes form as well. We have a few of these around Manhattan as well. So let's talk about precipitation, driving the hydrologic cycle. And we can see these blue areas are the areas with very high precipitation, the green areas, intermediate, and then the deserts are coming out in yellow. And we can see that there's areas that have a wide variety of ranges of precipitation, in millimeters per month. So this is basically, some of these are only a meter per month, which is this much every month. New Orleans right now is probably getting a meter of rain in 2 days. Yeah, so there's just this huge heterogeneity in how much water falls, and we're gonna see how the aquatic habitats, so there's none in the desert, but there's intermittent streams that are in areas that have intermediate precipitation or low precipitation, and permanent flows in areas that have high. And then, if the water holds back, we get these major aquifers that can form. And some of the ones that we've talked about already is the Ogallala, or the High Plains aquifer, that lies into the center of the United States here, is responsible for a good portion of the agricultural production of the states that are in this region. But then there are some other large and very deep aquifers that are scattered throughout the country. And these are the major ones. The minor ones that we're like when we get our groundwater for our drinking water here is coming out of basically the Kansas River Basin, and it's not any of these major ones. It's shallower groundwater than these big ones. But you get an idea of how complex all this is, and how much of the world that's under our feet that we don't necessarily know what's going on down there.
So all the different colors, they're all separated from each other?
They're geologically, yeah, they're separated from each other and they're geologically distinct, exactly. So like some of the ones that were under the desert Southwest are extraordinarily deep ones. Different residence time. So I'm going to go into the Ogallala aquifer a little bit more because it's important economically into the entire country, but also very economically to us here in this particular class. And in the states to the north and the south of us, this aquifer stretches from Nebraska to Texas. It supplies almost a third of the water that is used for irrigation in the entire country. Quite a bit. It is currently being used 10 times faster than the water's replenishing it, than the rainfall is replenishing it from water. This has really strong effects on the local rivers and streams. That essentially, there are a number of rivers and streams out in this area that have historically had consistent flow that now are completely dry. The United States Geological Survey put out an analysis of the Kansas River here in Manhattan. Even though we're not on the Ogallala aquifer, the watersheds drain from that area. And before this drought, basically from the early 2000s, it was under drought flows, right? That it was, the flows were lower than they were during the Dust Bowl times, even though we had normal temperature and normal precipitation over that time period. And that's because they're pulling the groundwater out to water the crops. It evaporates, and the groundwater that was feeding the rivers and streams that then flowed down to here were flowing less and less. So the effect is transmitted. Eventually, the shallower parts of it, they'll just deplete it all, or the energy cost of pumping water and lifting it that far will be more than the profit that can be made from irrigating, and they'll stop pumping that water. They were decreasing the pumping rates until the Bush administration passed a 51-cent a gallon stimulus for ethanol production. And then corn prices shot up. Once corn prices shot up, then it became economically feasible to pump some of these deeper waters again, and you can make more money on it. And so they increased the rate of depletion of the aquifer. So there's sort of cascading effect of economics that's kind of hard to predict from the point of, from local factors. So this is a map of the Ogallala aquifer, High Plains aquifer, and the one that's on the left is just the thickness, and it happens to be in feet. And you can see that some of it's 600 to 1,000 feet deep in the blues. Much of it is in the hundreds of feet deep in the brownish and yellows. So it's quite a huge reservoir of water that's accumulated over thousands of years. And then on the right-hand side is the water level change in the High Plains aquifer between 1980 and 1999. So over a 20-year period. This doesn't include that time period of accelerated use related to the increased growing of corn. And we can see that these areas in yellow are 5 to 10 feet water level change, and we have more than 50 feet and 40 to 60 feet for purples and the red. So we have some areas that it's been drawn down quite a bit. There's a few areas up in Nebraska where it's actually coming up, just because of precipitation, it's not being used fast enough to be replenished. So there are areas where it's increasing, but most of the areas, particularly Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, are being heavily depleted. This is something that speculators are really paying attention to, in the sense that it's still a source of water, and they're buying up the rights to this water so they can ship it off to Dallas and provide their water for them. It's becoming very valuable, this water. And I think I have, yeah, so this is the Arkansas River, as we call it here, although it's supposedly illegal to call it that in Arkansas. But this is the Ark River at the border of Colorado and Kansas, where it flows into Kansas. And there's a missing piece, but you can see the discharge on the y-axis, and that's a logarithmic scale, keep that in mind. And I've added 0.01 to that, so anytime when it's at 0.01, the river's actually dry. And so we have maybe one dry period here in the 20s, none through the Dust Bowl, maybe one right here, and very variable flow. And then once the lawsuits came into being, the Colorado pretty much held all the water that they could. If there was more extra water, they held it in their reservoirs, but they always had to be letting water out, so it actually stabilized the flow quite a bit. But it never dries. Now at Dodge City, this is just on the other side of the Ogallala aquifer. We go to even in the Dust Bowl, it was occasionally going dry, that river was occasionally going dry. Now it's always dry. Okay, so the Ark River is basically, it starts at the Great Bend Sewage Treatment Plant most of the time. Now, this is going to have a cascading effect on the organisms, because in the dry times, like this drought, when the large wetlands, Cheyenne Bottoms, and the other one is Quivira, dry, historically in the fall and the spring when the birds came through, if they couldn't stop there, they would stop the Arkansas River because it would be flowing. Now they have nowhere to stop. There's no surface water left. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens to these migratory waterfowl when they hit this particular situation. Because this is the first year since it's been continuously dry that we've had, the river's been continuously dry, that we've also had it be so dry that the wetlands are completely dry as well. All right, so there are these cascading effects that you may not be, you may not think of straight off. They say, oh, well, they're pumping water to water their crops, which is an important economic activity, but they do have some other consequences that we need to be aware of as we go through that. And, oh yeah, this is that study I was talking about. This shows basically all the gauges that have record low flows, even though precipitation is normal. We're essentially losing all the small streams out west. Bad for the biodiversity because there's some plains, minnows and fishes that depend on prairie streams out there that just have no habitat left.